The courtroom was thick with tension. The air itself seemed to weigh heavy with anticipation. Every eye in the room was fixed on the judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, infamous for her unforgiving rulings. She peered down at the defendant over the rim of her glasses, her lips curling ever so slightly into a smirk, a hint of amusement dancing in her otherwise cold expression. "Mr. David Miller," she finally spoke, her voice laced with condescension, stretching each syllable as if savoring the moment. "You've decided to represent yourself in this trial? Grand theft auto and resisting arrest, serious charges, young man. Are you absolutely certain you don't want a real attorney? This isn't a game, you know." David, a scrawny 18-year-old, hesitated for only a split second before rising to his feet. His hands, barely steady, adjusted the collar of his ill-fitting suit, a hand-me-down from his older brother, a size too big and a decade out of fashion. He looked every bit like a kid caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, nervous, out of his depth, and completely unprepared. A soft wave of chuckles rippled through the courtroom gallery. Even the prosecutor, a veteran attorney in an impeccably pressed suit, failed to suppress his smirk. This was going to be easy, or so they all thought. But when David finally spoke, his voice didn't waver. "Your Honor, I fully understand the gravity of the situation," he said, measured and firm. "I've reviewed the evidence, studied every detail, and I am confident in my ability to defend myself." The judge arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Confidence is one thing, Mr. Miller," she remarked, her tone almost dismissive. "Competence? That's another matter entirely. Let's see just how far your self-taught legal expertise can take you." The prosecutor, Mr. Grayson, stood then, adjusting his tie with an air of effortless authority. "Your Honor, the state is fully prepared to present its case. We have overwhelming evidence against the defendant, eyewitness testimony, video footage. This should be an open and shut case." David's heart pounded, but his face remained unreadable. He knew this was coming. He had spent weeks, months, even preparing for this very moment, studying legal texts, case precedents, memorizing every possible loophole. Because this wasn't just about his freedom. This was about exposing a system that had already decided his fate before he even set foot in that courtroom. As Mr. Grayson launched into his opening statement, David scanned the jury. Their expressions ranged from skeptical to indifferent. And then there was the judge, leaning back in her chair, twirling a pen between her fingers, already looking bored. They all thought this was a waste of time. A child playing lawyer. They had no idea what was coming. Mr. Grayson wasted no time. He called his first witness, Officer Daniels, the arresting officer. Daniels was a broad-shouldered man, his uniform neatly pressed, his stance unwavering. He took the stand with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. "Your Honor," he began, his voice deep and authoritative, "on the night in question, I responded to a call about a stolen black sedan. When I arrived at the location, I saw the defendant attempting to hotwire the vehicle. I identified myself as an officer and ordered him to stop. Instead, he ran, leading me on a brief chase before I successfully apprehended him." David sat motionless, absorbing every word, his fingers rapidly scribbling notes. His turn to cross-examine came faster than expected. Taking a steadying breath, he stood, his previous nervousness melting into something sharper, focused, controlled. "Officer Daniels," David began, his voice now carrying a different weight, "you testified that you saw me attempting to hotwire the car. Can you describe exactly what you saw?" Daniels hesitated, just for a moment. "I saw you leaning into the driver's side window, holding what appeared to be a tool. You were fumbling with the wires." David tilted his head slightly, as if considering. "And from what distance did you observe this?" "About 20 feet, Daniels answered. David let the response settle in the air. 20 feet in the dark, and you're absolutely certain that you saw me holding a tool and tampering with wires?" Daniels shifted, his confident posture faltering ever so slightly. "Yes," he said, though not as firmly this time. David turned to the judge. "Your Honor, may I approach the witness?" The judge, now a touch more intrigued, nodded. Proceed. David strode to the witness stand and placed a photograph in front of Daniels. Officer, this is a picture of the car in question. Could you point out where the wires are located? Daniels frowned at the image. They're inside the dashboard. David turned, addressing the jury. Inside the dashboard. Not visible from outside the vehicle. He let the words linger before shifting his gaze back to Daniels. So, tell me, officer, how could you have seen me tampering with wires through a closed window from 20 feet away, in the dark? A murmur rippled through the room. The prosecutor shot up. Objection. Speculation. David didn't flinch. Your Honor, if the prosecution's case hinges on observations that are physically impossible, then their entire argument collapses. The judge, now fully engaged, leaned forward. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Miller. David turned back to Daniels. One more thing, officer. You stated that I fled when you approached. Did you clearly identify yourself as a police officer before giving chase? Daniels hesitated. I believe I did. David arched a brow. You believe? Isn't it standard procedure to clearly announce yourself before pursuing a suspect? Yes, but... Thank you, officer. No further questions. As Daniels stepped down, the jury exchanged glances. The cracks in the prosecution's case had started to show. Next up was Mrs. Thompson, the owner of the allegedly stolen vehicle. A woman in her late 40s, arms crossed, displeasure etched into every line of her face. She recounted the events. I parked my car outside my house that night, she explained. When I woke up, it was gone. I reported it stolen. Later that day, the police found it, with him inside. David listened intently. Then his turn. Mrs. Thompson, he started, you said your car was stolen overnight. Did you see anyone take it? No, she admitted. I was asleep. David nodded. And when the police recovered the vehicle, was there any damage? Broken windows, forced locks.
She frowned. No.
The car was intact. David faced the jury. A car was stolen, yet there were no signs of forced entry. So, how did the thief get in? Mrs. Thompson hesitated. Maybe they had a key? David raised an eyebrow.
A key?
Who has access to your car keys? Just me and my husband. David turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to call my next witness, Mr. James Thompson. The prosecutor shot up. Objection. This witness wasn't disclosed. David remained calm. Your Honor, his testimony is crucial. The prosecution has had ample opportunity to investigate. The judge studied him for a moment, then nodded. Overruled. Call your witness. A tall, visibly nervous man stepped forward. Mr. Thompson, David began, do you own a black sedan? Yes. And did you lend it to anyone that night? Mr. Thompson hesitated, glancing at his wife. I lent it to my nephew, Alex. He needed it for a date. The courtroom erupted. David turned to the jury. So, the car wasn't stolen.